Hello everyone, we have here game number 2 against me playing against one of my students, which decided to stay anonymous at this point, so his name is not being displayed here. So I'm playing the black pieces this time. We are playing 15 minutes plus 5 seconds, and we have the Sicilian defense. Let's try to go for a Najdorf. I think the Najdorf Sicilian is probably a very popular opening. Actually, perhaps maybe at any level. But let's say one which is people are very likely to face. So c3 is played, kind of preparing the move pawn to d4. This move is not as popular as the move d4 immediately, but it's a fairly solid sideline. Usually black plays knight f6 in order to attack the pawn on e4. Even though this is actually not a threat at the moment, because if black takes this pawn, this is actually a fairly well-known trap. Then white has the move queen a4 check, collecting my knight on e4. So it's basically something that black must avoid. Black actually has a choice of a couple of moves. He can either develop his knight, a move like knight c6 or knight d7, or concentrating on developing his king side, moves like g6, bishop g7, and castle. So I kind of like the move knight to d7. So now when this diagonal is now blocked by my knight, it means that the move knight takes e4 becomes actually a threat, because this check on a4 doesn't exist anymore. So white must basically decide now how exactly he's going to react to this threat. Basically, I see two ways to do so. It's either playing pawn to d3 or playing a move like queen to c2, protecting the pawn on e4 while still preserving the option of going d4. Okay, so queen c2 is being played. So now white still wants to go his pawn to d4 to control the center better. So at this point, black has maybe more than two choices, but basically two conceptual choices, whether to just ignore the threat of d4 and continue its development. So once again, g6 makes sense, but I personally like the second option, which is to go queen to c7, which is a kind of a prophylactic move, because now if white plays d4, when I capture on d4, he cannot recapture with the pawn, because then he will hang the queen. So it means that he has to take with the knight, which is not exactly desirable, because he wants to eventually have the full center under his control. So he decides just to castle, which is of course an okay move. And now I must deal with my bishops. I think eventually both of them will be fianchettoed. The only question is, which one of these do I prefer to develop first? Perhaps it's not entirely important in this position, but I kinda like the fact that when I play b6 and bishop b7, I also put some immediate pressure on the pawn on e4, and I'm forcing white to make up his mind. So I will start with b6, even though the move g6 was also completely legitimate. Nothing really wrong about that move. Now it is the white move, and he needs to figure exactly what he wants to do about the pawn on e4, which is about to get under attack. So one thing that sometimes people do is play a move like rook e1, with the idea to eventually be able to protect the pawn on e4. Obviously, white has also simpler moves like d3. Even though d3 once again is a move that white is not 100% happy about playing, because when he initially played the move pawn to c3, he really wanted to eventually push his pawn all the way to d4. Yeah, so he plays knight to a3, which I think makes some sense, because the knight is searching for some better squares on b5 or c4. I will continue my development with bishop b7. Once again, the pawn on e4 is now under attack. Probably white will now play his pawn to d3, because it's not obvious whether he really has too many other choices. So if white plays d3, yeah, which he does, now I have once again this kind of a little choice of whether I want to develop my bishop this way or this way. Both of them in general possible, but definitely the more active one is to fan shadow the bishop. This is why I prefer to play my pawn to g6. This also means that whenever, I mean, if in the future white would still be able to push his pawn to d4, this bishop might exert some pressure on the long diagonal. So basically, this is one concept that it's worth keeping in mind, that when the opponent is trying to seize the center with the pawns, so exerting pressure from a distance, especially with bishops, is many times a good idea to discourage this kind of idea, because then these pawns, as you can see, get under immediate fire. So knight c4 has been played, trying to centralize his knight. So now I can choose whether to just continue my development with bishop to g7, which is a very sensible move, or you can also consider an aggressive move like d5 in the center in order to try to highlight perhaps the drawbacks of this knight being on c4, so using it as a means for me to gain some tempos. So usually my approach in such scenarios is to just continue my development. I don't really like making such aggressive moves in the center before finishing my development. Actually, I have another move in mind. I can also try to push this knight immediately with a move like b5, with the idea that once this knight moves away, let's say to e3 or d2, then it will kind of block this bishop from being developed. If I will play bishop g7 first, this bishop could get out somewhere, and then the move b5 will make less sense, because the knight can already land on e3 or d2 without blocking that bishop. So let me play bishop b5 right now. Yeah, so now there are three choices for white. Going back on a3 is kind of sad, because then the knight will be really passive throughout the game. So I think the only serious options that he has is really knight to e3 or knight to d2. Basically, both of them have the same drawback of hindering, at least slightly, his bishop on f1. Yeah, so so knight e3 is played, and I think now I can fairly safely play my bishop to g7. At some point I have to do this. So black is basically, I feel, is fairly well positioned here. White has never pushed his pawn to d4. This is why in many cases in this type of positions, white kind of switches his attention to try and breaking off in some other parts of the board. So for example, one plan for white might be to push a4. Yeah, like he did. So at this point I'm pretty much forced to play a6 because b4 is not really desirable. He can just take on b4 and I cannot recapture. Yeah, so a6 must be the move. I also kind of want to preserve my active pawn formation on the queen side. He can of course now exchange some pieces and force me to recapture with the bishop, but perhaps this is not too terrible for me. Another plan that white can implement in the as an option is moving this knight out of f3, let's say knight to g5, with the idea to push this f pawn forward. This is actually a pretty standard plan in positions with such pawn structure. So he chooses to play a5. I don't really like this move. I think this pawn on a5 in the long run can be a weakness, and in the next part of the game I will try to prove this point. I think this is a good time to castle. So now that black is almost fully developed, I'm already starting to think about what would be my plan. So one idea that really appeals to me is to push that c pawn forward with the idea to break off his pawn structure in the center, using the fact that I have a lot of pressure against the pawn on e4. So this means that when I play c4, he cannot really move this pawn too much, because then he will remove the defense from the e4 pawn. So basically it now means that c4 is, I would consider to be a strategic threat on my side, so he must react to it. I think that a good move for white is perhaps going knight to d2. Once again, the idea is to, on one hand, push the f pawn forward, but also the knight on d2 kind of helps to defend this pawn on e4 and makes my pawn break of c4 less likely to happen. The drawback of this move is that it makes the life of this bishop even more difficult, and they are currently quite difficult. I really feel like the knight on e3 is misplaced. Perhaps white should have preferred, instead of this maneuver that he did, a maneuver like knight e2, knight f1, knight g3, and then the knight would be better positioned and it would not disturb the development of the rest of his pieces. So rook e1 is played, and now this is not really dealing with the idea of c4, so I think I actually can play c4, and I will. I feel like this is a fairly important pawn break that black wishes to achieve. Amongst others, it also vacates this square for my knight, which means that if I ever want to exert even more pressure against his center, and I can also seek some juicy squares on the queen side with my knight, I can do that. So I think at this point, White's position is probably slightly worse. I don't think White should have allowed me to push my pawn to c4. From a positional point of view, that's a pretty nice achievement for me. I wouldn't expect to achieve such a move that easily. I'm kind of curious about what would be his next move, because to me it seems that the next move of White's is entirely not obvious. Knight f1. So yeah, this move really indicates that the knight should have maneuvered itself on f1 and g3 in first place. I think by now it's already kind of too late, it's too time consuming. Black is already very well positioned. Yeah, so now I think I have two good choices, whether to take on d3 first and then going knight c5, or going knight c5 immediately, which is also pretty appealing. Let's go knight c5. I kind of want to go with the same approach of keeping the tension and not forcing the game. I still claim that such an approach, from a practical point of view, is the most unpleasant for the opponent to face. It gives him the most kind of opportunities to go wrong. It gives him the most unpleasant choices, because if I would take on d3, then he would have to recapture, then I would play knight c5, then he would have to defend his pawn on e4. So basically he would know exactly what to react to. While if you slightly preserve the tension between the pieces, it immediately becomes less obvious of what to do next. So he's playing knight g3 at the moment, trying to maintain everything. So at this point, if I want to win a pawn, I can do it. I can play knight to b3, attacking the rook on a1, and once this rook is moving, I can just grab on a5. This would be admittedly a very kind of cheap approach, but it kind of comes just to highlight how weak is the pawn on a5. So his move of a5 from a couple of moves ago, I think at this point is pretty much proving to be probably not the best. This is just one option. The other one is just going for the two bishops advantage, which is to take on d3, and just be happy with the fact that I took his two bishops, which is also not a bad idea. It's kind of a tough choice here. It's always a difficult choice whether to, when you have a good position, when you have the initiative, whether to bail out and go get a pawn, but I think this maneuver is very slow, and it also misplacing my knight. It's not really a pawn I'm that much happy about taking, at least not in these conditions. I might have taken the pawn if it would still keep my initiative going. Basically, I can also go for the same approach of just keeping the tension, but I think at this point I'm less keen to do so, because if it's now white to move, he can actually take on c4, and my pawn on the pawn I cannot take the pawn on e4 with the bishop like I could do before, because the knight is protecting it. Okay, let's try to go with knight b3. I'm slightly also curious about where exactly his rook is going to go. Obviously not b1, because I think it's terribly passive. Basically it's either a3 or a2, with a3 being the one which makes just a tiny more sense, because it puts some little pressure against my knight. On the next move, I will have to decide though whether I take the pawn or not, which once again is definitely not a mistake. You can take the pawn. You just have to realize that once you took the pawn, you pass the move to the opponent. You also have to misplace your knight along the way, and it means that now maybe the opponent is the one who is having a small initiative. That's all. So here we are. The choices are either to take the pawn, or once again going for the bishops, just taking his bishop on c1, maybe taking on d3, playing a move like knight to d7, and basically just playing a position with the two bishops advantage. Even though by all means the most principled option is to take a pawn, I must say, because then I will have the majority on the queen side. I will have 3 pawns versus 2 pawns. In the long run, I will have a plan of creating a passed pawn on that side of the board. Okay, let's go for the brave approach, or the simple approach. I would just take on a5, and I will claim that even though white is getting a small initiative at this point, his positions are not that well coordinated, which means that he cannot really use his initiative properly. So d4 is being played. This one is anticipated, and I think it's now a good time for me to meet his pawn in the center with my own pawn, even though this allows some tactics to happen. Okay, let's go knight b3 first. My knight on a5 was misplaced. It was also hanging in some variations. I just wanted to get back into the game. So the square on b3 is actually not that bad for him. It's keeping an eye against the bishop on c5, and also if I ever will be able to remove this pawn out of d4, I will have a square on my knight on c5. So he plays bishop f4, preventing me from pushing e5. So if I want to insist on playing e5, I can play a move like knight d7 right now, preparing e5 once again. I think I will do it. I can also prepare e5 by the means of rook to e8. Yeah, I think both of these make make some sense with each one having their own pros and cons. Yeah, let's go with 97. So next move, I definitely want to play e5. I don't really think white can avoid me from playing e5. He can just try to make the move e5, let's say, less attractive. But just to stop it altogether, I don't really see how. I think white at this point needs to start thinking about how exactly should he attack on the king side, because my king side is the side of the board where I'm just slightly bit exposed. Most of my pieces, as you can see, are concentrated on the queen side of the board, so it actually makes a lot of sense for white to try and attack on the king side, to attack on the opposing side to the opponent's pieces. And also many of white's pieces are concentrated on the king side, so maybe at some point a possible plan for him could be to push his h pawn forward with the idea to open up some lines there. So for the time being, he's playing his pawn to d5. Now I think black's counterplay must be related to eventually this pawn break f5. I think playing it immediately might be too early, but it's definitely in the cards. I think I will play knight c5 at the moment. This is once again a very nice square for this knight, putting some pressure against his pawn on e4, defending, overprotecting my knight on b3, and also eyeballing this square on d3, which can be now penetrated with my pieces. He goes h4. Yeah, so now I'm basically thinking whether should I push f5 immediately or should I prepare it with queen d7. Being kind of low on time, let's go for the simpler approach of queen to d7. So definitely my next move is f5 if white does nothing to stop it. It's not very easy for white to actually stop it. Yeah, so he plays h5 going for his own counterplay. But I think I will insist on playing f5 at this point, because with this move f5 I'm activating all of my pieces at once. I'm getting an open file for my rook. I also want to liberate this bishop on b7, which is at the moment hitting kind of a wall of pawns, and I want to remove this obstacle for the bishop in order to activate it. And I'm also threatening to push f4 and to fork him. So All in all, white needs to make a very responsible decision at this point. He cannot just make any move. I think that if I were white, I would maybe try to take on g6 and basically try to complicate the position as much as possible. He plays h6. Yeah, so this pawn is always a mystery. Sometimes it is a very good pawn, and sometimes it is a weakness. So basically later on in the game we will see we would see whether it's weak or not. For the time being I have to play bishop to h8, I think. If I would play bishop to f6, it would expose my pawn on f5 to some attacks. So takes on f5, I think I will recapture. So now I need to be a little bit careful as black, because if at one point the white queen manages to reach the g file, this could be extremely problematic for me. He plays bishop g5. I want to take this pawn on d5, which I think is a very important pawn. Now my bishop got activated. So this position is becoming pretty sharp, but white is doing quite well on time and I'm not. That's my main problem. Let's push f4. We should not forget that this game is being played with an increment of 5 seconds, which means that it's not so easy for me to lose on time. Even if I play a couple of quick moves, I should be able to regain some time on the clock. Knight f5. Isn't this allowing this move? So it's basically a double attack. White might have some moves like bishop takes c4 check in order to then recapture my bishop, but I don't think it's really too scary for me because he still is losing some material in the process. Another option for white is to play a move like knight to e7 check, but this probably will fail because I can just take it, and when he recaptures my queen I take his queen. White should lose some material in this case. Yeah, in this position I think it's pretty difficult for white. The material balance on the board is black having 2 pieces and 2 pawns for a rook. This should be, I think, more than sufficient to win. I want to play also e4 just not to allow any squares for this bishop. This knight wants to check. Yeah, let's just not allow it. So this is a discovered attack right there. Yeah, this is getting pretty unpleasant. Whoops. Yeah. This is getting kind of sharp in time trouble, like it always is. But black simply has too many pawns, which means this should be ended pretty soon. Oh, this is actually a nice checkmate. So with this checkmate, I want to congratulate my opponent for a very tough game. I will see him very, very soon.